A first-class passenger was forced to switch seats simply because of her skin color. The flight attendant smirked, thinking she had the upper hand. But 5 minutes later, an unexpected revelation turned the tables, and by the time the plane landed, the entire crew was fired. The soft hum of the aircraft filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats. It was a routine flight from New York to Los Angeles, nothing out of the ordinary, at least not yet. In first class, among the crisp suits and designer handbags, sat a young black woman, her presence seemingly out of place in the eyes of some. She was dressed simply but elegantly, her curly hair tied back in a neat bun. She placed her carry-on beneath her seat, pulled out a book, and began reading, unaware of the storm quietly brewing around her. A few rows ahead, a middle-aged white man adjusted his tie, his gaze flickering toward her, then toward the flight attendant approaching from the aisle. The attendant, a blonde woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority, stopped beside the young woman's seat, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Excuse me, miss," she said, her voice carrying the unmistakable edge of condescension. "I believe you're in the wrong seat." The young woman blinked, lifting her eyes from the page. "No, I don't think so," she replied calmly, reaching into her bag and pulling out her boarding pass. "Seat 3A, right here." The flight attendant barely glanced at the ticket before shaking her head. "There must be some mistake. Are you sure this is your ticket?" A few passengers turned their heads, sensing tension. The young woman exhaled slowly, keeping her composure. "Yes, I booked this seat." But the flight attendant's tone turned firmer. "I think you should move to the back of the plane. We have some seating adjustments to make." Seating adjustments. A vague excuse wrapped in the false politeness of customer service. The young woman knew what this was. She had seen it before, felt it before, in a dozen different ways throughout her life. She hesitated, glancing around, feeling the weight of a dozen silent stares. Some passengers watched with curiosity, others quickly turned away, pretending not to notice. From across the aisle, a woman in her 50s, dressed in a navy blazer, frowned. "She has her ticket," the woman interjected. "Why are you making her move?" The flight attendant barely acknowledged her. Instead, she turned back to the young woman, her patience wearing thin. "Miss, I need you to cooperate." The young woman's grip on her book tightened, but she nodded, exhaling through her nose. She had learned long ago that arguing never ended well. With slow, deliberate movements, she unbuckled her seatbelt, picked up her bag, and stepped into the aisle. As she moved toward the back of the plane, she heard a hushed murmur ripple through the cabin. Some people whispered, some shook their heads, but no one stood up to stop it. The man who had been watching earlier smirked as she walked past. She didn't react. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Reaching the cramped rows of economy class, she found a new seat, smaller, less comfortable, with less legroom. She sat down, staring out the window, willing herself to stay calm. It was just another day, just another reminder. But what she didn't know was that someone else had been watching too. Someone with far more power than a flight attendant. And in just a few minutes, the balance of power on that flight was about to shift in a way no one saw coming. The air inside the cabin was thick with unspoken tension. Passengers settled in, fastening their seatbelts, but a few exchanged glances, their eyes flickering back to the young woman now seated in economy. The injustice had been clear, yet no one had done anything to stop it. The flight attendant, satisfied with her so-called seating adjustment, walked back toward the front of the plane, her expression smug, as if she had restored order. The young woman, however, remained still. She wasn't going to cause a scene, wasn't going to demand an apology. She had long learned that dignity was often quieter than confrontation. But the weight of what had just happened sat heavy in her chest. She tightened her grip on her book, staring blankly at the pages, her mind replaying the moment over and over again. Then, just as the plane was preparing for takeoff, a deep, measured voice cut through the quiet hum of the cabin. "Excuse me." The flight attendant turned, her expression shifting slightly when she saw who had spoken. A man, tall, poised, with an air of quiet authority, had risen from his seat in first class. He wore a crisp navy suit, his polished shoes planted firmly in the aisle. His face was unreadable, but his presence alone commanded attention. "I'd like to understand why that passenger was asked to move," he said, his voice even, but carrying a weight that made the surrounding passengers sit up just a little straighter. The flight attendant blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "Sir, there was a seating adjustment that needed to be made," she replied, her voice a little less sure than before. "It was just a simple mistake." The man tilted his head slightly, his sharp gaze unwavering. "A mistake?" he repeated. "She had a first-class ticket, didn't she?" The flight attendant hesitated. A few nearby passengers turned to watch, sensing something shifting in the air. "Well, yes, but you forced her to move anyway." His tone didn't change, but there was something in his demeanor that sent a ripple of unease through the cabin. The flight attendant stiffened, suddenly aware that eyes were on her, that the quiet indifference of the passengers had begun to crack. "Sir, I don't see how this concerns you," she said, trying to regain control of the situation. "If you'd like to take your seat." "It concerns me," the man interrupted, his voice still calm, but carrying a distinct edge now. "Because I know exactly what just happened here, and I can assure you, it won't be ignored." A few rows back, the young woman had lifted her gaze, watching the exchange unfold. She didn't recognize the man, but something about the way he spoke, the confidence in his posture, it felt different. He wasn't just another bystander expressing fleeting disapproval. He was speaking as if he had power, real power. The flight attendant forced a tight smile. "Sir, I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," he cut in smoothly. "I'm stating a fact. You singled out a paying passenger and removed her from her rightful seat for no reason other than your own prejudice. And now, you're scrambling to justify it." The tension was now undeniable. Other passengers were murmuring, shifting in their seats, stealing glances toward the confrontation. The flight attendant swallowed, her confidence unraveling. "Sir, if you have a complaint, I can direct you to—" "You'll be directed to someone, all right," he said, reaching into his suit jacket. He pulled out a sleek embossed business card and placed it firmly on the flight attendant's service tray. "That's my name. I'd suggest you take a good look at it." The flight attendant's fingers trembled as she picked up the card. And then, as she read the name, the color drained from her face. It wasn't just a name, it was a title. Senior Executive, Corporate Affairs. The realization hit her like a slap. The man standing in front of her wasn't just another passenger. He was one of the highest-ranking executives of the very airline she worked for. The young woman in economy watched as the flight attendant's posture stiffened, her confident facade crumbling under the weight of her mistake. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. The entire crew had just made a catastrophic error, and in just a few more minutes, they would face the consequences they never saw coming. The cabin was no longer just a quiet, routine flight. It had become a stage, and every passenger was now an audience member to an unfolding drama. The flight attendant, still gripping the business card, stood frozen in place. Her mind raced, trying to piece together a response, trying to salvage the authority she had so effortlessly wielded just moments ago. But it was too late. The man in the navy suit, the senior executive of corporate affairs, remained standing, his gaze unwavering. He had given her a chance to explain, to acknowledge the wrongdoing, but now he was watching her crumble under the weight of her own arrogance. The young woman who had been humiliated was still seated in economy, watching. But now her eyes carried something new: recognition. A ripple of murmurs spread through the passengers. People who had once averted their eyes were now paying attention, leaning in, whispering amongst themselves. A few reached for their phones, subtly recording, sensing that this was something bigger than a simple disagreement over a seat. The flight attendant swallowed hard and forced a smile, the kind that barely masked panic. I didn't realize," she stammered. "Sir, of course there was no intentional discrimination here. It was just a misunderstanding." The executive cut in, his voice dangerously calm. He took a slow step forward, and though he wasn't speaking loudly, every word seemed to land with crushing weight. "That's an interesting way to describe what just happened, because from where I'm standing, it looked quite intentional." The flight attendant opened her mouth, then closed it, her mind scrambling for an excuse, any excuse. She turned, as if silently pleading for backup from her colleagues, but the other crew members looked just as shaken as she was. Then, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, breaking through the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are just moments away from takeoff. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin." But no one was preparing anything. The cabin was far from ready. The executive sighed, glanced down at his watch, and then turned back to the flight attendant. "You know, I was planning to take this flight as a regular passenger," he mused. "I wanted to experience firsthand what our customers go through. But it turns out, I didn't have to wait long to see a serious problem." A deep, unbearable silence followed. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably. The entire crew was watching now, along with half the cabin. "Tell me," he continued, his voice deceptively mild, "how often do these kinds of mistakes happen?" The flight attendant hesitated. "Sir, because I'd be very interested in knowing," he pressed. "How many paying passengers have you forced out of their seats based on nothing but your own bias? How many have you humiliated simply because you thought you could?" The young woman in economy held her breath. She had spent years brushing off these microaggressions, swallowing her pride, telling herself that fighting back wasn't worth the energy. But now, she was watching someone with power, real power, demand justice on her behalf. The flight attendant's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Sir, please," she whispered, desperate to make this go away. "Can we discuss this after the flight?" But the executive wasn't finished. He turned to another flight attendant standing nearby. "Is your supervisor on this flight?" The second attendant hesitated before nodding. Yes, sir. I'll get her right away." The supervisor, a woman in her early 50s, wearing a crisp uniform and an expression that was equal parts professional and terrified, arrived within seconds. She took one look at the executive, at the panicked expression of her colleague, and immediately knew this was a disaster in the making. "Sir," she began, her tone carefully measured, "I sincerely apologize for any miscommunication." "Miscommunication?" He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Your flight attendant publicly humiliated a passenger, ignored her legitimate ticket, and forced her to move to the back of the plane. That's not a miscommunication. That's a systemic problem." The supervisor's hands clasped together tightly. "Sir, Please, I assure you, this does not reflect our airline's values. Doesn't it? His eyebrows lifted. Because I have a feeling this isn't an isolated incident. The passengers were now openly watching, no longer pretending to mind their own business. Someone was definitely recording. The young woman in economy didn't move. She wasn't used to seeing consequences unfold so quickly, so publicly. She had spent a lifetime being told to just let things go. And yet, here was a man who refused to do just that. Finally, the executive let out a slow breath and straightened his tie. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his tone brokering no argument. "This flight is going to take off, but when we land, this crew, including the flight attendant responsible for this incident, will be met by corporate representatives. And if I find out that anything like this has happened before, I assure you, it won't just be one person losing their job." The flight attendant looked like she might collapse. The supervisor swallowed hard and nodded. "Understood, sir." The executive turned, scanning the cabin. His eyes landed on the young woman still seated in economy. "Miss," he said, his voice softer now, "please, come back to your original seat." For a moment, she hesitated, not out of fear, but out of sheer disbelief. Then, slowly, she stood, walking back toward first class. But as she passed the flight attendant, the same one who had sneered at her minutes ago, she saw the woman's eyes drop to the floor, no longer superior, no longer in control. She returned to her rightful seat, buckled her seatbelt, opened her book again. The plane took off. And 5 minutes later, as the world outside the window disappeared into the clouds, an entire flight crew realized their careers were hanging in the balance. The plane soared into the sky, but the tension in the cabin had not lifted. It clung to the air, thick and suffocating, as the flight crew tried to regain their composure. The flight attendant who had forced the young woman out of her seat was no longer standing tall. She was stiff, her hands clenched at her sides, her face a ghostly shade of white. She knew what was coming. The young woman, now back in her rightful first-class seat, remained composed. She didn't look toward the flight attendant, didn't gloat, didn't even acknowledge the whispers around her. Instead, she simply turned a page in her book, as if nothing had happened. And yet, everything had. From across the aisle, the senior executive of corporate affairs watched her for a moment before turning his attention back to the crew. He reached for his phone, fingers moving swiftly across the screen. He wasn't recording. He didn't need to. His word alone would be enough. Minutes passed, but for the flight crew, they stretched endlessly. Then, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have been informed of an internal matter that will be addressed upon landing. We appreciate your cooperation and thank you for choosing to fly with us." Passengers exchanged glances. An internal matter? Everyone knew exactly what that meant. The flight attendant's breath came shallow. She looked to the supervisor for help, but the older woman refused to meet her gaze. There was nothing to be done. The decision had already been made. The executive finally spoke again, his voice cutting through the thick silence. "You do understand what happens next, don't you?" he asked, his words measured but sharp. The flight attendant swallowed hard. "Sir, please. I didn't mean to—" "You meant to," he interrupted. "You saw her, and you made a decision. And now, you're going to face the consequences of that decision." The other crew members looked down, shifting uncomfortably. None of them spoke up in her defense. No one wanted to go down with her. A few rows behind, a passenger whispered, "She deserves it." Another muttered, "Should have known better." The flight attendant felt the walls closing in. She had spent years moving through the world with unchecked authority, with the silent approval of those around her. But now, for the first time, there were consequences. And worse, there was no way out. The executive leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. He didn't need to say anything else. The flight was still hours away from landing, but for the crew, it already felt like the end. And it was. By the time they touched down, their careers would never be the same. The wheels touched the runway with a jolt, but for the flight crew, the real impact was yet to come. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the flight attendant sat rigid in her jump seat, her fingers gripping the edges so tightly, her knuckles turned white. She didn't dare look toward first class, didn't dare meet the executive's gaze. She knew she had lost. The young woman, still seated in 3A, exhaled slowly. She wasn't smiling, wasn't gloating, just sitting in quiet dignity. She had learned long ago that justice didn't always come quickly, but today it had arrived before the plane even landed. Then, the announcement came. Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that all passengers remain seated for a moment. Representatives from our corporate office will be boarding shortly. A ripple of murmurs swept through the cabin. Passengers glanced around, eyes widening. This wasn't normal. The flight crew, once confident and composed, looked like prisoners awaiting sentencing. The jet bridge connected. The door opened. And then, they arrived. Two sharply dressed airline officials stepped onto the plane, their expressions unreadable. They moved with precision, scanning the cabin before locking eyes with the flight attendant. Without hesitation, one of them spoke. "Please step forward." Her breath hitched. She hesitated, but there was no escape. Slowly, shakily, she stood. The entire plane watched in silence. No one defended her. No one protested. The official continued, his voice firm. "You are relieved of duty effective immediately. Your employment status will be reviewed. But as of now, you are no longer permitted to serve on any flights under this airline." The words hit harder than she had expected. She had spent years in this uniform, believing she had power over others, believing she could act without consequence. But now, stripped of authority, she was nothing more than another passenger, one forced to walk a path of humiliation, just as she had done to others before. As she stepped off the plane, the young woman in 3A finally looked up. Their eyes met for a brief second. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Justice had already spoken. The flight attendant disappeared down the jet bridge, swallowed by the consequences of her actions. The weight of the moment lingered in the air, an unspoken understanding that something significant had just happened. The young woman remained in her seat for a moment longer, staring out the window. She hadn't asked for this battle. She had simply wanted to take her flight like any other passenger. But today, she had been forced to face something much bigger than a single act of discrimination. The executive stood, adjusting his suit jacket before turning to her. His voice was quieter now, but still carried the same authority. "I'm sorry this happened to you," he said. She looked at him, searching for any trace of insincerity, but found none. She gave a small nod. "Thank you for standing up." His lips pressed into a thin line. "It shouldn't have taken me, or anyone else, for this to be made right." She exhaled, the exhaustion of the ordeal settling in. "It happens more often than you think." He held her gaze for a moment, then sighed. "Not anymore. Not if I have anything to do with it." With that, he turned and walked off the plane, leaving behind a silent promise. As the passengers slowly began to disembark, many of them glanced at her, some with silent acknowledgement, others with shame. The world was changing, maybe not fast enough, but today had been proof that sometimes justice arrived sooner than expected. So, what do you think? Should more people with power step in when they witness injustice? Have you ever experienced or seen something like this? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's keep these conversations going, because every voice matters.